It started as one of those calm afternoons that Washington, D.C. occasionally gifts to the world. The kind where the sky looks soft and harmless, and the city moves with predictable rhythm. There were tourists lingering near the iron fence of the White House, snapping pictures, laughing lightly, and completely unaware of the fragile balance surrounding them. Even the National Guard seemed more relaxed than usual, standing watch, exchanging quiet words, scanning the streets out of habit rather than alarm. People always imagine that danger in the Capitol comes with warnings: strange behavior, suspicious bags, a sudden alarm. But on this day, there was nothing. No tension in the air, no shadow moving against the flow. Just the usual mix of politics, sightseeing, and routine. One of the guardsmen later described it as the kind of day where the city feels half asleep. And maybe that was the cruelest trick of all, how peaceful everything felt mere seconds before it shattered. The first sign wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, that sudden, instinctive shift people get when something is about to go wrong. A mother glanced around sharply. A man paused mid-conversation. Even the birds on a nearby tree scattered before anyone heard a thing. And then it came. Gunfire. Not one shot, but several. Sharp, metallic cracks that sliced through the calm, echoed against the walls of government buildings, and sent a tremor of panic rushing through the crowd. People screamed, ducked, grabbed their children, dropped their phones, stumbled behind benches and concrete barriers. The National Guard reacted instantly, hands on their rifles, eyes searching for the source, adrenaline slamming through their bodies. But even with training, the shock was undeniable. No one expects to be targeted in the very heart of the nation's power. In those first chaotic moments, confusion spread faster than fear. Was this an attack on the White House? A random shooter? A coordinated strike? No one knew, and not knowing was its own kind of horror. The gunfire echoed through Pennsylvania Avenue, bouncing between stone and steel, turning the familiar city into something unrecognizable. Cars screeched to a halt, tour guide groups scattered, and officers shouted for people to get down, voice trembling despite his authority. What made everything worse was how close it felt, as if danger was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. For a brief moment, all that existed was panic. The sharp crack of shots, the thundering of running feet, the choking swirl of fear. A guard member near the north fence grabbed his partner's vest and pulled him behind a barrier, shouting for him to stay low. Another signaled toward the metro entrance, believing that was where the shots came from. The uncertainty made every second feel double its length. And in the middle of this chaos, there were the bystanders, some crying, some frozen, others shaking so hard they couldn't speak. One teenager whispered, "Why here? Why today?" What no one understood yet was that this wasn't a random burst of violence. It was directed, intentional. And the National Guard, the very people sworn to protect the area, were the first targets. As sirens began to rise in the distance, as officers and agents sprinted toward the scene, the city shifted from peaceful calm to controlled chaos. The kind that leaves a mark, not just on buildings or streets, but on everyone who hears the sound of gunfire where it should never exist. In the end, that ordinary afternoon would be remembered not for its calm, but for the moment it was violently taken away. The first officers who reached the scene later said the same thing. It felt unreal, like walking into a moment that wasn't supposed to exist. Because the closer they got to the metro entrance on 15th Street, the clearer it became that this wasn't a chaotic accident. It was an ambush. Deliberate, targeted, cold. The gunman had positioned himself in a spot where the National Guard passed every hour, where the view was partially obscured by a pillar and a line of parked maintenance vehicles. He didn't fire at random. He waited, chose his moment, and then aimed directly at the guard. One of the soldiers was hit almost immediately, a sharp impact to his side that dropped him before he could even call for backup. A second round struck another guardsman in the chest plate, knocking him backward onto the pavement. People screamed and scattered, rushing up the metro stairs, tripping over one another in panic. A woman lost her shoe as she ran and didn't even look back. A man fell on the sidewalk and scrambled behind a trash bin, sobbing, and chaos wasn't spreading, it was exploding. Police officers arriving from Pennsylvania Avenue began shouting commands, their voices cracking from strain. Down! Get down! Move away from the entrance! But the shooter was already on the move. He sprinted toward a service alley, blending into the wave of terrified civilians. Some witnesses said he pulled a hoodie over his head. Others swore he dropped something metallic behind a bicycle rack. Minutes later, Secret Service officers found a handgun shoved behind an electrical box, still warm. Yet despite the panic all around, there were bystanders who tried to help. A young couple knelt beside one of the wounded guardsmen, pressing their hands against the bleeding with shaking fingers. A taxi driver used his jacket to cover another victim, whispering, "Stay with me, man. Just stay with me." One woman called her mother while trying to keep pressure on a wound, her voice breaking. "I don't know what's happening. I don't know if we're safe." And through all this, sirens grew louder, a wave of urgency rushing toward the epicenter. Ambulances screeched to a stop. Medics jumped out before the vehicles even fully halted. They were fast, but the damage was severe. They worked on the first soldier. Compressions, oxygen mask, shouting vital signs. The second was drifting in and out, mumbling something nobody could understand. The crowd watched with horrified silence. Some filmed, some prayed, some just stared at their own trembling hands, unsure what to do next. When officers finally located the shooter in the alley, he was trying, and failing, to blend into the chaos. A Secret Service agent tackled him so hard both men hit the ground. The shooter screamed, kicked, tried to reach for his pocket, but 3 more agents piled on, pinning him down. The arrest didn't stop the fear, didn't stop the confusion, didn't stop the questions crashing like waves. Why the National Guard? Was he acting alone? Did he know the patrol schedule? Was this an extremist? A personal vendetta? A larger plan? Because when someone opens fire just steps from the White House perimeter, people don't assume coincidence. They assume intention and escalation. For the next hour, the streets around the attack transformed into a fortress. Helicopters circled above. Armored vehicles blocked intersections. Agents with rifles scanned rooftops and alleyways. The city felt frozen, like time had splintered into a moment of shock that no one could climb out of. And beneath all the noise, all the commands, all the running officers and flashing lights, was the quiet truth that everyone felt but no one said aloud. This wasn't over. Not really. Even with the shooter in custody, the consequences of what he'd done were only beginning to unfold. Blood still pooled on the pavement near the metro stairs. Tourists huddled together, crying softly. A child asked if the bad guy was gone now. The calm afternoon was gone. The sense of safety was gone. And the city, the entire country, was left holding its breath. Because after an attack like this, everyone knows, the aftermath is often more frightening than the moment itself. In the hours after the shooting, Washington, D.C. felt strangely silent. Not in sound, but in spirit. The city that usually buzzed with noise, politics, and constant motion seemed to fall into a heavy stillness, as if holding its breath. News spread quickly, faster than officials could confirm details. By early evening, it was official. One National Guard member had died from his injuries. The other remained in critical condition, fighting for his life in a trauma unit just a few miles away. The city reacted with shock, anger, and heartbreak. People gathered near the security barriers, placing flowers, small candles, handwritten notes. A child left a tiny American flag that fluttered weakly in the cold breeze. Someone whispered, They were just doing their job. Officers stood nearby with bowed heads, their expressions a mix of fatigue and sorrow. Members of the guard who had been on duty earlier returned to the scene, quietly embracing each other, some staring at the ground as if replaying the moment over and over in their minds. Tragedy near the White House. It hits differently. It feels heavier, closer, impossible to rationalize. Soon, journalists and reporters flooded the area. Cameras flashed, microphones pushed forward. Questions flew like sparks. How did the shooter get so close? Was this preventable? Was there a political motive? But officials offered only fragments, facts too fragile to form a complete picture. The shooter was in custody. The weapon had been recovered. Investigators were exploring possible motives. And yet, none of that answered the question that mattered most to people standing behind the barricades. Why? Why target the National Guard? Why here? Why now? Theories appeared everywhere, on news channels, in comment sections, on social media threads spiraling into panic. Some people blamed political extremism. Others suspected a mental health crisis. Some insisted it had to be a larger plot. But the truth remained out of reach, buried under fear and speculation. Inside the hospital, the surviving guardsman's family waited through the night, clinging to any updates doctors could offer. Officers stood outside the ICU, guarding the doorway not because they expected danger, but because standing there felt like the only thing they could do. Meanwhile, the White House issued a statement calling the attack a direct assault on those who protect our nation's capital. Officials promised a full investigation and an immediate review of security protocols around federal buildings and public access routes. Some civilians found comfort in those words. Others only felt more unease. Because if such a planned, targeted attack could happen here, within sight of the most heavily guarded residents in the United States, then what else was possible? How many other vulnerabilities existed in places people believed were impenetrable? Late that night, the memorial grew. Flowers, flags, photos of the fallen guardsmen printed on warm paper that curled at the edges in the cold. People arrived quietly, some alone, some in small groups. A man removed his cap and pressed it to his chest. A woman wiped tears from her face with the sleeve of her coat. Tourists stood in stunned silence, unsure how to reconcile their expectations of the capital with the reality playing out before them. The city was grieving, not just the loss of a life, but the loss of a sense of safety. The illusion that the center of American power was untouchable had cracked, and through that crack poured fear, anger, and uncertainty. And yet, as always, life tried to move forward. By the next morning, traffic roared again along Constitution Avenue. Workers hurried to offices. Students filled the sidewalks. Security tightened. Patrols doubled. Barriers reinforced. It looked like a return to normalcy, but everyone who had been there the day before knew better. Normal had shifted. Normal had changed. Normal wasn't coming back. The attack left a scar on the city, one that wouldn't fade quickly. And even though justice seemed swift, answers were still missing. Answers that families, officers, and an entire nation desperately needed. Because after a tragedy like this, the hardest part isn't the moment of violence. It's what comes after. The fear that lingers, the questions that won't go away, and the understanding that even in the heart of power, danger can find its way in.